The book of First Kings. When it comes to the authorship, no one really knows the author of First and Second Kings, though some commentators have suggested it could be Ezra, Ezekiel, or Jeremiah as the possible authors. And because the entire work encompasses a time period of more than 400 years, several source materials were used to compile the records. So certain clues such as literary styles, themes woven throughout the book, and the nature of material used point to a single compiler or author rather than the multiple compilers or authors. This person assembled the manuscript while God's people were in exile at Babylon, and you can see 2 Kings. But he didn't complete the work until the Babylonians released King Jehoiachin after 37 years in prison in 560 BC, and most likely completing it within another 20 years. So when it comes to the dates, the book was literally written between 560 and 540 BC, less than 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So most likely completing it within another 20 years after that. And so when it comes to the date, the books were written between 560 and 540 BC, less than 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And 586 BC is an important, pivotal mark in history that we need to recall when it comes to God's history. When it comes to the purpose and summary, 1st and 2nd Kings are the sequel to 1st and 2nd Samuel, and they should be read as a continuation of the history of Israel that started in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So originally it was one book, and 1st and 2nd Kings relate the history of Israel from the end of David's reign through Solomon's reign and through the division of Solomon's kingdom into northern and southern kingdoms to the destruction of the northern kingdom, in other words, Israel, in 722 BC, and the fall of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom, which is Judah, in 586 BC. So this was a period of Israel's glory, division, and decline and fall. The books of Kings were written while the first temple was standing. 1st and 2nd Kings are just a continuation again of the books of Samuel. As their name suggests, they record the events of the reign of Solomon and then of the succeeding kings of Judah and Israel. They cover a period of 400 years and tell the story of the growth and then the decay of the kingdom. We see the kingdom divided. We see both Israel and Judah led into captivity. And the southern kingdom, Judah, had 20 kings. And the northern kingdom, Israel, had 19 kings. So one can consider that these could be two of the most important books of history in the world. And remember that these books of Kings cover practically the whole rule of the kings over God's chosen people. So 1 Kings opens describing the final days of King David around 971 BC and the conspiracy surrounding a succession. So when David died, and you can see 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 10, Solomon ascended the throne and established himself as a wise leader. In the early years of Solomon's reign, Israel experienced its glory days. Its influence, economy, military power enjoyed little opposition, and its neighbors posed no strong military threat. But shortly after Solomon's death in 931 BC, mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 43, the kingdom was divided into northern Israel and the southern Judah entities. 1 Kings follows the history of this divided kingdom through the year 853 BC. So during Solomon's reign, the kingdom reached the height of its grandeur, which the death of Solomon, the kingship really ceased to be the medium through which God governed his people. So it was at this point that Elijah comes to the scene and introduced the period of the prophets. So 1 King ends with the story of this prophet. So some of the key elements when it comes to 1 Kings is this. 1, God does not show favoritism. And number 2, when everything that's ours is on the altar, God never keeps us waiting for the fire. And 3, the final captivity was because of disobedience to God. And it was prophesied in Deuteronomy 28:49 about this. What has God said about the individual who forgets him? In this case, that these books also have several bookends when it comes to the writings. And so the bookends to this are these. 1, they begin with King David and end with the king of Babylon. And that's one bookend. 2, they open with the building of the temple and then ends with the burning of the temple. That's another bookend. And then 3rd, they open with David's first successor to the throne, Solomon, and end with David's last successor, Jehoiachin, released from captivity by the king of Babylon. And so this is some of the structure in the writings. But in addition to that, we see in 1 Kings chapters 1 through 10, the splendid reign of Solomon. And then in 1 Kings chapters 11 through 16, we see the division of the kingdom. And finally, in 1 Kings chapters 17 to 23, we see the ministry of Elijah the prophet. And so when it comes to this, the key verse in this book, there's a number of passages we could look at, but the one I want to highlight to you is in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 20. And it says, "Now the Lord has fulfilled his word which he spoke. For I have risen in place of my father David and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel." And so you see the God of the generations here, and you see that Solomon took place on the throne of Israel, as he promised David. And you see this succession of how God moves. And some other key verses that you could take a look at in 1 Kings is 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 2 to 5, 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 23 to 26, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 66, and a couple more I'll mention, 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 4 through 9, and lastly, 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 36 to 39. And as you read this book, Christ is portrayed as our king and covenant keeper. And so we know that Jesus, he is our king, and he is not only the promise giver, but the covenant keeper. And I want to highlight a couple points to remember as we conclude the book of 1 Kings. So in 1 Kings, we see that the kingdom of Israel was filled with pride and arrogance, and that led to them falling apart. And the history of the Jews is a record of God's dealing with disobedient children. But in all of God's disciplines, even in that, he's kind and merciful, and he still loves them, and he shows his affection towards them. And the secret of the downfall of the Jewish people is found in really 2 Kings 3:2, that he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So we need to be loyal and true to God, and it does not pay to do evil. In fact, it brings a curse. And this is the book of 1 Kings.